For the first 10 years following the Battle of Yavin, and during the bulk of the fighting between the early New Republic and crumbling Empire, the fleets of the New Republic were largely made of ships used by the Rebel Alliance. A few new designs like the MC-80B, MC-90, and E-Wing starfighter crept their way into service, but the bulk of the campaigns we hear about are conducted by classic ships and ship types like the Nebula B, Corellian Corvette, MC-80s, and of course the reliable X and Y-Wings, despite the ever-growing industrial capabilities of the New Republic government and multiple swings in what the command structure viewed as the most effective doctrine, which I've touched on in recent videos about the superships of the era. One program was implemented to comprehensively overhaul the hardware used by the New Republic's Navy, the New Class Modernization Program, described primarily in the Black Fleet Crisis trilogy. Compared to the Imperial model, where a lone Star Destroyer may operate for years on their own, subjugating a system or other local area on behalf of the Empire, the New Class program in the New Republic emphasized pocket capital ships and fighter superiority, with multiple capital ships in varying roles complementing each other within a fleet for targeted engagements and supplies scaled accordingly, limited to a few months' worth, rather than long-term deployments, which was a big factor in allowing the ships to be smaller. The first iteration of what would become the New Class program was the earlier Defender program, set up shortly after Endor with plans for a new fighter, assault carrier, and Star Destroyer, all with the name Defender class. A series of destructive campaigns against Thrawn and the Reborn Emperor delayed these initial plans, pushing them back into the later and broader New Class program. On the smaller end of these new classes, which had begun entering service by at most 12 years after the Battle of Yavin, we have the Sacheen, Hajen, Agave, and Warrior. To increase efficiency in the fleet, the new class ships tended to have two classes built off of the same hull. The Agave picket ship and the Warrior gunship shared a 190-meter hull, while the Sacheen light escort and the Hajen fleet tender shared a 375-meter hull. A significant step up from there, the 700-meter Defender-class assault carrier, which provided key fighter support in the program and originated under the Defender program, shared a hull with the Majestic heavy cruiser, which was more geared towards direct ship-to-ship combat. Going beyond those and topping off the classes, we have the 1,040-meter Endurance-class fleet carrier and Nebula-class Star Destroyer. These were intended to become the new flagships and centerpieces of the New Republic fleets, replacing the old-style 1,600-meter Star Destroyers for this new galactic powerhouse, and these new ships would theoretically form the core of the New Republic's fleets going forward. This is where we start to run into problems, however. The lore surrounding the New Class Modernization program has always been, to put it politely, an absolute mess. While many of these classes, along with a couple more, like the Belarus, were introduced by hard sci-fi author Michael P. Cube McDowell, who did really well setting up the inspirations and fleet overviews, a lot of what he said just got entirely disregarded, both by other authors writing about his ships and by others choosing not to write about his ships. In the former case, we have Kraken's Threat dossier, an RPG sourcebook bringing together content from the Courtship of Princess Leia novel, the Corellian trilogy novels, and the Black Fleet Crisis trilogy, which is what we're primarily talking about today. It added new information to what Cube McDowell wrote about the new class ships, with the minor problem that almost all of it contradicted what Cube McDowell had already written about the new class ships, particularly when it came to how the sourcebook depicted the ships. Remember how I said the same hull designs were shared between certain classes? Well, the Kraken Threat dossier art does not show that at all. To be fair, many of the details on naming and class development only seem to come from Q&A materials by Cube McDowell, though to be even more fair, at least some elements of his notes for these classes were included in the book, so they were at least aware of it. Eventually, in the Essential Guide to Warfare, which came out in 2012, the Endurance and Nebula were given new official designs by Fractal Sponge, which more directly matched the albeit limited descriptions in the books, which brings us to the bigger issue of the Nebula class in general. While the Endurance class as a name is explicitly in the Black Fleet books, the Nebula and the other class names are not. Cube McDowell's Q&A page answers have most of these in his list, which were picked up by the Threat dossier, but one notable exception exists. There's no Nebula in the Threat dossier, and instead there's a Defender-class Star Destroyer. While Cube McDowell didn't use the name in his book, so it's arguably fair game to change, a few months after the Threat dossier came out, Timothy Zahn mentioned the Endurance and the Nebula class by name in his Hand of Thrawn duology, which is important for a different reason we'll get to in a moment, but which does establish the name as something used in an official source. Other details around the Nebula/Endurance become a mess because of this as well, but I think the Essential Guide to Warfare and its online endnotes do a decent job explaining away the issue, saying the ship just went through a few name changes over its long and troubled development. With this explanation, it started as the Nebula, got renamed to the Defender, and then got renamed back to the Nebula after the Defender program fell through. Sometimes people will try to explain it as two different classes, but I typically don't think that's the best way to handle it. With this new setup for the New Republic fleet coming into play, and as of 16 ABY, filling at least the New Republic 5th Fleet, the fleet primarily responsible for the fight against the xenophobic Yavithans who had stolen the lost Imperial Black Fleet, you'd think it would set the tone for the future of the New Republic military in stories released after 1996, when the Black Fleet Crisis books were released, but you'd be very wrong. Despite the fact that Del Rey's acquisition of the Star Wars book publishing license from Bantam kicked off with a 19-book series bringing together authors, characters, and events from all corners of the prior publishing world in a way we kind of take for granted today, but which wasn't exactly the norm before, the reference to the Nebulas and Endurances in the Hand of Thrawn duology were the only mentions of the new class ships in any books after their introduction. Throughout the Yuuzhan Vong War, the New Republic was back to Nebulon Bs and X-Wings, rather than new class ships and K-Wings. The K-Wing, a heavy bomber type introduced by the Black Fleet Crisis, does get one mention in Legacy of the Force Fury after its introduction. Wikipedia credits it with another appearance in New Jedi Order Star by Star during the Yuuzhan Vong War, but I both don't remember that and can't seem to find what that's referring to in the book itself. It's entirely possible it is something that I'm just not finding, because as with any other source, you should never assume I know what I'm talking about myself, but I don't think it's there. Please do let me know in the comments if you have found it. That potential appearance and the Hand of Thrawn mention aside, these ships remain essentially absent from any books beyond their introduction. I think part of this is the desire to stick with something familiar. People know what a Corellian Corvette, Star Destroyer, and Mon Calamari Cruiser are. So if you're writing a Star Wars book and want to pull people in, they make the most sense to use rather than replacing them if at all possible. I think this idea is also at the root of some fan complaints about other eras mimicking the style of the original trilogy or prequel trilogy too much. For example, some fans feel like the troopers in the Old Republic look too much like clone troopers, and the Sith always seem to have giant space triangles. And once you step outside those limitations, a lot of authors would probably rather just make up their own stuff. Although from the New Jedi Order period on, a lot of ships which were introduced did have a higher likelihood to return after their first appearance. Sourcebooks or reference books like Starships of the Galaxy and the Essential Guide to Warfare did continue to give at least some screen time to the new class ships, but it never really caught on within the actual stories. One notable appearance from at least some of these classes is in the Invasion comics, which came out towards the end of the Legends run, and where some Defenders in particular, going by that name rather than the name Nebula, do show up as part of the New Republic's forces. This was slightly before the Essential Guide to Warfare's new designs for the ships came out, and I think if you're going to make an argument for them being two separate classes, this is probably the best point for it. All in all though, I think the New Class Modernization Program is one of the better examples of how messy transmedia storytelling with multiple authors can sometimes be, especially as the ideas around canon and what that means to a franchise like Star Wars were even less settled than they are today. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.